Hello and welcome to Political Party. I'm Hamish.
And I'm Tim. Welcome to our special budget edition.
To our surprise double-length episode of Political Party.
It can't even be a surprise anymore, though. Is he ever here?
Yes, he was here last week.
He's come for like 2 episodes, so sorry everyone who's waiting to hear some waka waka DJ.
Fat beats is the correct word, Tim.
Sorry. We will be having the majority of this show today is going to be a debate about the federal budget.
We've budgeted lots of time for this discussion.
It's the federal budget has happened, and you all no longer care because it's come and gone, and social media has turned us all into somewhat attention deficited population.
Like goldfish, really, except without the whole fish part.
Probably. with us today, we've got Blake. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Blake. I'm a member of the Liberal Party. I've been working as a gopher with them now for a couple of years, so running around, doing some odd jobs for the party. I've recently just returned from Canberra on the budget, working up there. So, yeah, I'm here to kind of convince you all that the budget's worthwhile.
Beautiful. And we have Daniel. Again, welcome back.
Hi.
Introduce yourself again.
Thanks very much. So I guess I'm here unofficially as the Labor Party supporter. I'm not a member of the party per se. I am involved with some elements of the student union, but other than that, I am just a personal supporter of the Australian Labor Party. So all of my opinions are my own, but they just so happen to align most of the time with the Labor Party. So I'm here for them today.
Yeah. I'm just going to say for full disclosure that I am a member of the Greens Party at the Macedon Rangers branch, and I'm somewhat involved there, I guess. So I'm going to champion that argument for the sake of this debate. And Hamish, what are you going to do today?
What am I going to do today? Well, I don't really know what to think, so I'm going to have these three chaps try to persuade me on what to think.
Beautiful. So the way this is going to run is we'll have each sort of person here say their thoughts on the budget, and then we'll go through some talking points. So burden's on you, Blake, to start off this debate. So do you want to give us a rough rundown of what you think the budget was good at, what it was bad at, and why we should like it?
Yeah,
Go
sure.
ahead.
Well, look, you want to take a look at what the budget has done quite well in comparison to, let's say, last year's budget. The first thing it did was it was boring. The budget is this year, if you want to look at what the official kind of line is that it's bringing budget back to its basic roots. It's trying to say that we're not going to make this the big ticket area. We're not going to announce our big spending programs, our big policies now because it didn't work the last time. What instead we're actually going to try and do is we're going to go back to the traditional way of doing a budget. We're going to give you the numbers, we're going to give you the figures, we're going to tell you actually what the state of the economy is, and then we're going to do our economic proposals from there. It's an interesting budget. $90 billion of revenue have been forecast to be lost over the next 5 years. We're going to lose $2.5 billion in red tape. And at the same time, though, it's also good to see that we're going to get a lower dollar, which the Bureau of Statistics says is going to help some manufacturing industries gain a little bit more feasibility in Australia. It's also taking into consideration 3 new trade agreements with major East Asian partners. We've got tax cuts for small business, which is absolutely fantastic for anyone that earns less than $2 million. For any small business that earns less than $2 million.
Really helps them mind their business.
Witty, very, very witty. They'll get a nice 2% tax cut, and they'll also get deductions for business purchases under $20,000, which is fantastic. If you're a business owner that needs a new coffee machine or a new cash register, you can buy that type of thing, and the government will put it on the tick. You'll also get fringe benefits tax exemption on portable electronics, which means that if you're a business owner and you want to buy a laptop or a phone for your business, you'll get a deduction on that too. But this budget's also a really big winner for actually 2 other groups, I reckon, and that is regional Australia and its families of young people, quite simply because now, giggles, regional Australia is going to get a massive bonus in regards to farmers will be able to claim fencing on tax. Anyone that knows anything about a farm, fencing is extremely expensive. And if you look at deductions, as Warren Truss has actually said in Parliament, the majority of farmers write a lot on fence repair, but mysteriously not that many farmers are actually putting in new fences these past few years. We're also seeing a $5 billion investment to Northern Australia, programs in Western Australia, Northern Territory, and Northern Queensland. It's going to see construction of roads, railways, pipelines, and communications equipment, in addition to a $100 million fund for the Great Barrier Reef Preservation Scheme. Family care, once again, $7 billion of funding for childcare over the next 3 years, $3.5 billion this year alone. We're seeing a nanny trial program, $350 million to youth training, $10 million special training programs for entrenched unemployment situations, and New Start allowance is going to be available from 4 weeks as opposed to 6 weeks. So once again, struggling students and struggling people just coming out of school and all that will have access to much better to their assistance a lot quicker. We're also seeing the first numbers for the defence force in regards to Iraq. We're going to see $407 million in the next 4 years spent combating the Islamic State in Iraq. $500 million will be saved this year on closing 17 detention centres in Australia and abroad. And we're also seeing a review of how transnational corporations is going to be spending tax in Australia. That's one of the big things too. We're seeing a lot of we're seeing what they're calling an expansion of fairness and equality. We're seeing these organisations are going to be studied. We're going to see how they're actually shifting profits overseas. And there's going to be new laws in place to basically say that if a transnational corporation tries to unfairly shift their profits overseas, they're going to have to pay double what they owe to the Australian Tax Office. So all in all, I think that it is a boring budget. I think that there's no big stop the press, wowee, we're going to, I don't know, eat the poor type of situations that some people would kind of like us to have said. But the reality is, though, is that this is the new political climate. I think that if you look at what news polls reactions were this morning, it's the most popular budget in 7 years. And in addition to that, though, news polls also saying that the voters believe that Labor couldn't have done it any better. And the reality is, though, is that as a private citizen, just my personal opinion is quite simply because politics in our country, particularly in regards to budgeting and spending, is becoming a lot more centralized. It's becoming something which people in general are becoming a lot more cohesive on.
Daniel, take it away.
Oh, all right. There's I mean, I don't have like you've done your notes so well. I feel like I have almost underprepared. But look, I think the budget was definitely interesting. I agree that it was largely boring, but that was both a good and a bad thing. So this budget ultimately was just about jobs, and more specifically, Tony's and Joe's, right? So this budget was not really speaking to what our country needs. It wasn't outlining any sort of plan to get our economy back on track. Our deficit is going up and up and up. And I think that 18 months into a Liberal government, it is we're too far into this election cycle for the Liberals to still be blaming the Labor government for all of our economic woes, as they put it. Right? I think it's time for Joe and for Tony to take some responsibility and admit that last year their budget was a complete failure. They've done nothing to steady our economy. They're driving it ever so faster towards the ground. And I think that they need to take a leaf out of Kevin's book way back in the day and look at more stimulus spending to help stimulate our economy. Because, I mean, we've seen the RBA rate cuts. We've seen, as Blake outlined, all of that like lovely data that is predicting some pretty horrible things for our economy. We're losing a lot of revenue. Our investment has it's gone down 4 times from 8 to 2% of our GDP. So we're losing $96 billion of investment. So, it's not looking particularly bright for Australia. And there needs to be improvement on that. So I think that there are definitely some really boring shades that they're not there. Yeah, you're right. It's not big ticket politics. It's very much let's go small target government, right? Which I think is pretty irresponsible. I think that the Liberals, last year I had a begrudging respect for the fact that they had a plan for Australia. It was a disastrous plan, but they had a plan nonetheless that they were like, all right, we're going to stick to this. This year, they've instead decided to hide a lot of those spending cuts, a lot of those really horrible policies that affect some of the poorest people in our country and some of the most hardworking people in our country. all of these cuts have been hidden, right? So with tax bracket creep, we've seen, like the Medicare rebate freeze to try and reintroduce the co-payment, all of this sort of stuff. It's very clandestine. And I think that's why the Australian people so far have responded, relatively positively towards the budget, because the Liberals have done a fantastic job of hiding some of these savage spending cuts, right? So, we're looking at, things like the deregulation of fees as well. So that's right back on the table. I think the people have already spoken. Students at this university and universities across Australia have spoken out against the deregulation of fees. I was born in the United States. So when I was born, my family immediately started saving money for me to go to college, because in America, if you don't start saving from the day your child is born, you're stuffed, right? Like there's no chance that they'll get to go to a decent college, and there's no chance that they'll get a decent education, right? So I was lucky enough to move to this country at a very young age where that was no longer a problem. And my parents knew that my future was secure because the degrees here don't cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we have a very strong HEC system, and we basically don't have these private institutions taking over the education system, which I think is the direction that the Liberal Party want to take us. And for me, that's very scary. And I think about, the world that my children, the Australia my children will live in. And I don't want them to live in, the new America. I got out of that place for a reason, as much as I still love it. So I think also, I won't take too much more time, but the waiting period for the dole. So we've gone to 4 weeks instead of 6 months. That's still a huge delay on people who need money to survive. Like I just don't quite understand that. I think it would be like if we were looking at foreign aid, which of course has been slashed. One of the biggest cuts in the history of our country to foreign aid has taken place in this budget. But if we were looking at foreign aid in other countries and saying, oh, no, sorry, starving people in X village in X country, you can't have any assistance from us for a few weeks, right? Because we just think you need to earn it, right? You need to earn it by suffering a bit more, by going through a little bit more hardship. And to me, that's just unconscionable, right? And then lastly, small business tax, yeah, that's fantastic. I definitely agree with the tax breaks there. And funnily enough, that was a Labor policy originally. The Liberals opposed the tax breaks to the Labor put through in the last Parliament. The $20,000 tax break was originally $6,500 under the Labor government. That was set up by the Labor government, and the Liberals cut that in last year's budget to $1,000, then realised that actually that harms small business, it's bad for our economy, and they could score a lot of points in the polls if they decided to hike that up to $20,000. Whilst I still support that, I think it just shows the desperation and the populism that we're seeing them resort to, and I apologise if I went on a bit of a rant there.
Beautiful.
Nah, that's what we want.
That's what we're about here. We're about shaking shit up, because this is political party after all. So looking at this as a Greens supporter, the budget had some good stuff. I think I'm willing to acknowledge that Australia has a limited revenue, and therefore it's very difficult to allocate money to certain areas and be able to suffice everybody's demands, right? I think the tax cuts for small business was an incredibly good move. It's certainly a great, banner to put across the front of the Liberal Party going into the next election. I think that was the Liberals trying to save themselves from impending doom. $100 million, as you said, was given to over 4 years for preservation of the Great Barrier Reef, which is it seems counterintuitive, given that they're trying to dig up the entire Galilee Basin for coal on the grounds that, our country's power needs necessitate that, even though they're going to start. This is going to be completely ineffective once there's no World Heritage label on that particular area. Taxing on TNCs is an important thing. Rio Tinto last year paid only 3% tax. They've been, using the double Dutch, sandwich kind of tax avoidance method to avoid paying tax in Australia, and it seems like the middle class is bearing the brunt, as it always has. But the burden is sort of on everyone to pay their taxes. So I'm not gonna say why the middle class is so unfairly disadvantaged here. I think the Liberal government's done really good in that instance as well. Deregulation is still there. Fee deregulation for tertiary education. That's going to propose even more of a barrier. Again, I don't think that's going to get through because the Labor Party and the Greens aren't stupid. I think that fee deregulation is just going to create more barriers for people to get into education in a society where we're increasingly reliant on an educated populace, given that we're no longer seeing manufacturing being a particularly booming industry, as we've seen in Victoria particularly. Indigenous communities are having their the government is relegating municipal and like essential services to Indigenous outstations and communities in the Northern Territory with a one-off payment of $115 million. I think that's just grossly unfair because these remote Australian communities now will be vulnerable to the same kind of forced foreclosure of communities that we saw in Western Australia. There was a health funding decrease to Indigenous services as well, which granted it wasn't much. In fact, I think it was only a $3 million cut. But the fact that they didn't increase it like necessitated, I think that that's quite unfair. Mentally ill funding. The government cut this severely, but they still the government sort of has this National Health and Medical Research Council, which makes recommendations to the party on where money is needed to be spent and stuff. This council made 20 recommendations to the government in the since the last federal budget. All of them were ignored, and instead the Liberal Party decided that they were going to fund, the lowest mental illness support program since the pre-Rudd era. And they're putting money into areas which are already established, such as headspace centres. So they're being pretty counterproductive with the limited amount of funding that they've put aside for one of Australia's most vulnerable groups. Domestic violence victims, legal aid funding has been severed severely. We need advocacy funding and we need help support services for victims of domestic violence. It shouldn't just be non-government organisations whose job it should be to take care of them, More people are dying of domestic violence in 1 week than we've had terrorist deaths over the last bloody eons of time. So, again, that's sort of another problem with this budget, that the government's gone willy-nilly on defence spending on the premise that, we need to meet our obligations to keep our allies happy. I think that's complete shit. Purely because, there's a $450 million boost to national security by giving intelligence agencies more resources, whatever. Intelligence gathering agencies have got a $300 million increase, so they can, boost their technological capabilities and stuff. Surveillance of the population is what we need, right? $131 million has been given to telcos to fund the data retention servers. Again, that was something that Australia didn't need, nor does it, support democracy in any particular sense. The funding for fighting ISIL overseas is, I think it's $403 million, and look, that's kind of important, and I would agree with that. But they're spending way too much money on homebound surveillance for that sort of stuff. I don't think that's particularly fair. The money's better spent elsewhere, given that there's a limited amount of revenue. And finally, in terms of the environment, the funding, as I said, to the Great Barrier Reef was quite good, but counterproductive, because that is not going to do anything in the long run. The Emissions Reduction Fund has been allocated an inadequate amount of money to meet even the most dumbed-down version of the renewable energy target that the government wants to set. So Australia's going to go to Paris this year looking like as big of a fool as it did at the G20. Hamish, what do you think?
Well, I mean, There are some parts of the budget that I'm all right with, like the others. I mean, I think that the cuts to small business are a good thing because small businesses were really hit hard during the recession and during the high dollar. And especially with the high Australian dollar, a lot of small retailers, I know one of my friend's dads had to sell his store because it became unprofitable simply because owing to the high Australian dollar, they couldn't compete with online businesses. So I feel like in many ways, the tax cuts and the low dollar have come too little too late for some people. But it's still good to see that the effort is being made. I think it's also very important that we ensure that our big multinational corporations pay their dues, especially those whose business is extracting the bones of this country and shipping them overseas. I don't actually have as much of a problem with foreign aid funding as I should. Foreign aid funding cuts. Because, I mean, yes, they're being cut by $1 billion, which really isn't very good. But at the same time, there were a lot... Foreign aid spending has been inflated a lot by very high levels of executive pay. I mean... There are over 800 people involved in foreign aid who get paid in the order of, $200,000 each. So that is a lot of money that could be saved. Having said that, cutting $1 billion may have been excessive, but I still feel that in many ways NGOs are a more effective means of providing foreign aid simply because they work on a small level. They work on grassroots and they're going to stay regardless of whether the government keeps paying them or not. But
Are we allowed to jump in with a rebuttal now, or are you sort of having your statement?
When he finishes talking, we'll go to a song and then we'll have a debate.
Gotcha.
In the next
Gotcha.
25
I'm
minutes.
raring to go. Sorry, continue, Hamish.
Still, like I said, $1 billion is a bit too much. I'd like to just feel like to reiterate that. And it's very important that we keep our neighbours stable through foreign aid so as to prevent refugees or conflict from spilling over into our borders.
What conflict spilling over?
Hypothetical conflicts that would happen without foreign aid. So when it comes to military spending, yes, we need to spend a lot to meet our alliance obligations, but the simple fact of the matter is that the Australian military is completely worthless without working with its allies. The Australian Navy is incapable of doing anything by itself. We can only run 3 of our submarines at a time out of 6 because we only have the crew for 3, let alone the working submarines. They're so often being maintained or dry docked or whatever. We have 3 or 4 frigates, no destroyers. We have 2 big carrier type ships that are completely worthless without an escort except for humanitarian relief. But really, why would you want such a big ship for humanitarian relief? We didn't buy these things for humanitarian relief. We bought them for actual combat, and they're kind of useless without escorting vessels. So we need to work with our allies. We need to meet those funding commitments. Otherwise, we've just got this big, expensive navy that's completely useless. As it is, they can only really contribute to joint task forces. The army's pretty good, but it's mostly an elite force. It's really small, and we have hardly any armored vehicles, which is not going to be very good in case of a war. So fundamentally, we need to meet our alliance obligations. Otherwise, we just won't be able to defend ourselves. It's as simple as that. What other budget areas are there?
We'll come back to a debate. We'll go to a song first. This song we're going to play is about the struggle of the working class, and I think that's a good link to the it's a good link to the small business cuts that we were talking about earlier.
They're struggling now.
Yeah, there's this is a cover of a John Lennon song actually. This is Green Day, Working Class Hero. Welcome back to Political Party with Tim and Hamish. We've got Blake from the Liberals, Daniel from the Labor, and we've got Avanti sitting off to the side here.
Avanti is also a Liberal.
We've just had each person give their position on the budget, and now we're gonna try and debate some of these issues like civilized people. And like civilized people, we're gonna start this off with the always controversial Hamish talking about foreign aid.
Well, I mean,
Go for it.
What does civilization provide if not an orderly and stable forum for massive disagreement? So, my opinion of foreign aid is that it's important that the government provides some services in foreign aid, such as assisting in the building of roads and instructing, because it's very unlikely you're going to find these kinds of people in the private sector willing to sacrifice their jobs and travel abroad. But having said that, a lot of small infrastructure is better carried out by NGOs, in my opinion, simply because they have the funding. They will remain in place even if the government withdraws funding to them. And they're generally going to be more efficient than the government simply because of the limited funds they have to work with. So they're going to be more efficient, but the government should still provide some form of foreign aid, and it is important that the government provide foreign aid to prevent our neighbours from becoming unstable due to lack of money, which would result in the government being able to not function properly, lack of infrastructure, etc. So,
All right. So I take a couple of issues with Hamish's point. So I'm going to switch away from, ALP supporter here. I'm going to throw on my World Vision cap, right? So again, opinions are just my own, but I do also happen to work at World Vision Australia, one of the world's largest NGOs, Australia's largest overseas aid and development non-governmental organisation. And so we have an operating revenue of about $350 million per year. I've seen with my own eyes the difference that programs that World Vision Australia runs all across the world have made to the poorest people on the planet, right? People who struggle to eat every single day, people who struggle to send their kids to school and can barely afford a few cents to pay for them to sit their exams, right? So this stuff is just some of the biggest injustice on our planet today. And so World Vision does a great job in combating this sort of stuff. Donate to World Vision, guys, particularly Nepal earthquake appeal, like seriously. But 12% of that $350 million comes from AusAid, right? 12% of our revenue comes from government funding. It's the same for a lot of other NGOs. We rely quite heavily on government funding for our programs, particularly in areas like Indonesia, and a lot of the foreign aid cuts are going to completely wipe out some of the programs in Africa. Some of the programs that I've actually seen myself. I went to Rwanda last year and I saw some amazing food security projects with the AusAid stamp on them. You see the little kangaroo and it makes you really proud. It's gone now, right? So these are some of the poorest people on the world who are now going to be punished because of the Liberals' mismanagement of our economy, right? And of course, foreign aid is just the easiest thing in the world to cut because these people have no voice, and we're only decreasing that voice by doing this, right? It's the biggest cut we've ever seen, and it's such an insignificant amount of money in our budget anyway, right? So this slash right now is about $1 billion. All right. All you would have to do is close a single corporate tax loophole, right? You could make one multinational corporation pay their fair share of tax and you funded all of foreign aid for years and years to come. It is a tiny amount of money. It is a tiny percentage of our GDP. We do not meet our international requirements. We are not paying our fair share to the poorest people in the world who suffer some of the greatest injustices on the planet, and we need to do more. And we can do more, but we refuse to, and it's absolutely ridiculous.
Fair enough, but
Yeah, definitely. I think that you've got, there's a few definitely good points there regarding that. But I think another thing that we should actually look at is the efficiency of an aid program. And for starters, the entire concept that you're just supposition that if government is the one that is getting the money and government therefore is the most efficient at providing it. And I definitely think that's wrong. I think that what we actually should be looking at is instead corporatizing aid. And actually, you actually provide private companies that actually make a profit off delivering aid. You might even see a bit of a change there, quite simply because these companies and these people will actually have to actively campaign and actively prove that they have the ability to deliver the goods for the money that they're getting paid to provide the service. I think that it's definitely the case that it shouldn't. I definitely don't think that people should be held hostage for the fact that we are going through a budget crisis in regards to aid. But at the same time, though, I think that we should also not shy away from the fact that we're in this situation because of the fact also, too, that the Labor government did under the last previous kind of 2.5 litres, shall we say, Rudd, Gillard, and then Rudd Light, with stevia, 30% stevia in it. We saw that basically this government continued to just increase spending broadly and at the same time, though, unsustainably increase aid in that period of time. Now, I agree, though, it shouldn't be the case that people are suffering. But you also look at it, sub-Saharan Africa wasn't actually receiving much. Once again, though, aid is actually a political tool, if you want to look at it quite simply. And if you want to look at it, our aid is deliberately designed to provide stability for the Pacific region and Southeast Asia, Indo-Pacific region. I think that if we're going to talk about aid and our contribution to the world, we should also look at the fact that Australia is one of the largest kind of private donor bases on Earth. Australians give more aid than than most other G20 nations as private individuals. And I think that that's the thing, though. I think that if individuals are getting tax cuts, if individuals are making money, I think it should be their choice and their decision to give money. give money to Médecins Sans Frontières, give money to World Vision, give money to the Nepal Relief Fund. And at the same time, though, we're also seeing that under this government, we're seeing more money is given to what's called appropriated aid. It is aid that is given specifically for emergencies around the world. And I think that the immediate government's reaction and investment in Nepal's relief fund was a clear
Sorry, it's
sign.
about $2 million, $1 million?
Oh, it's more than that.
Or
I mean,
five?
it's an initial
A tiny
$2 million,
amount.
plus there's an additional $7 million in long-term redevelopment projects being thrown in there too. Yeah.
Can I jump back in? Or did...
Sure.
There was also something I wanted to say. Like, surely, this is another controversial viewpoint, but surely the role of a government should be to look after its own people first and the international community second. I mean, while we experience this deficit, while Australian jobs are being lost and people living in poverty, the Australian government should surely focus on helping its own rather than assisting the international community.
Okay, so sticking with the World Vision cap here, all right, I'm gonna try and address these before I forget them. Right, so first, I think the idea of a private aid sector is terrifying, right? So I think that it speaks to an ideological inconsistency there, right? So there's a great Nelson Mandela quote that I swear everyone at World Vision loves to just recite on a daily basis. It's like our mantra, that overcoming poverty is not an act of charity, it is an act of justice, okay? So the way that our world has been set up has positioned over 1 billion people to believe that they have less, they deserve less because they have less, right? It's positioned over 1 billion people to live in abject poverty, live in the most horrible conditions on the planet simply because when they were born, they were unlucky enough to be born in that statistic. And when we were born, we were lucky enough to be born in a country like Australia, where we get to enjoy all of the benefits of this fantastic nation, right? So it's pure luck that we ended up here and they ended up there, right? So we have a responsibility to change that. And I think the second you start introducing profit motives, you're going to start looking at, okay, what's the most profitable thing we can do as a private aid company, not what's the best thing for the people who need this aid the most, okay? And then I think there's also, I don't want to get like, okay, we don't want to get too far off the budget sort of here, but I think that aid efficiency is such a tricky subject, right? Because it is so difficult to just put a number, like a percentage of, like, okay, XYZ breakdown of funds, therefore this program is good, therefore this program is bad, right? Because there are some programs that incur much higher administration costs because of the country, because of the location, because of like the political climate, all of these things that really do make a difference, right? And so like that is tricky in itself. And I think that once the government tries to start playing numbers with that, once they've already, like we don't even have a proper aid organization as part of the government anymore. So who is there to do that research? It's gone to shambles. And I think that ultimately it's such an insignificant amount of money, right? And I do agree with you, Hamish, that we should be ensuring that all of our citizens get a fair go in Australia first. But not only is the government not doing that, particularly with the money that they're cutting from the aid budget, they're not reinvesting that, in the poorest people here, right? Like we're still seeing a 4-week waiting period for the dole. We're still seeing this work for the dole. Like, you have to apply for 5 bajillion jobs, right? All of this sort of stuff is just cutting, it's cuts to the poorest people here as well, because just like the poorest people around the world, they're an easy target, right? And that's what this government is all about.
Yeah, we're definitely all about, just basically screwing the poor over. I think that's a completely inappropriate statement to be making, quite simply because, though, once again, the Labor Party has put us in this situation. I mean, you want to talk...
I'm sorry, it's too late
Let him
for that.
finish, please.
I think it's inappropriate to actually point out the fact. I don't think that it's really appropriate to go out there and actually say, oh, well, this government's done this government's done that. I don't think that it's definitely not the case that a Liberal government is going out there deliberately just to screw the poor over. Poor people are if you want to look at it from the most simply political operative point, poor people are voters too, and the reality is that people that come from low economic backgrounds are people that are not going to are people that still vote, and I don't think that we're just cutting funding as a consequence of that. It is the fact, though, that we have a limited budget. It is the fact that at the moment, if you look at the economy, if you look at the way that things are going, we don't necessarily know what's going to happen in the next few years because the economy is changing, because the global economy is changing, because the global situation is changing. And I also think that, and as a consequence of this, though, we have to be a little bit more careful. And it's hard to actually designate where you're going to just throw money here and there and all that. But I also think that you live in a magic pudding world where effectively you think we should throw money here, we should throw money there, let's give a little bit of money there. Oh, hang on, he needs a little bit of money too, just give it there. Why can't it be, though, that we actually get individuals and private people? I know it's an ideological position, but I personally believe that if you want to do something, or if individuals want to do something, then they should do it themselves. And I think ultimately, you actually look at it, the success of our country, the fact that 70% of our country's employment comes from small business, it derives from that quite simple fact that if individuals actually want to do something, they'll do it and they'll succeed.
Cool. I'm gonna jump in there. I think that it was pretty negligent to put all the blame on the, like, this is coming from a Green supporter. It was pretty negligent to put all the blame on the Liberal Party, saying, "Oh, you're just leaving like poor people out to die." Like, sure, there's a lot of severe inefficiencies in pretty much every Liberal policy ever towards the people who need the money most, but the Liberal Party is trying to deliver, like looking at this as a pragmatist, right? The Liberal Party is looking at ways in which that they can reduce poverty by funding other areas, like small business and stuff, right? Like, all of those kind of programs are how the Liberal Party sees they're going to help the poor. They're not literally trying to put them out on the curb. But back to foreign aid, right? Firstly, I think that private donorship is probably the single worst possible model, because you already have that under the status quo. The government has more capital, but what do they do with that money, right? What does aid look like? They stop poverty, disease. They help countries modernize. They build military bases in countries, right? They give that money to NGOs to fund that. But there's certain stuff that NGOs cannot do, right? Stuff like teaching effective governance, right? Helping train military, helping train police forces. The government is in a pivotal role in doing aid, and whether that aid is through advisors, whether that aid is through funding towards poverty reduction schemes, whether that money is towards gender equality programs, which Julie Bishop is championing at the moment on the tail of the Rudd Gillard government's push for gender inequality overseas. I think that that's perfectly fine. So the government does have an absolutely pivotal, if not the most central role here in funding aid, and the fact that they've cut it is an absolute abomination. Avanti, you wanted to say something?
A single point about the cutting of the aid. Australia recognises that its dollar is now one of the highest in the world. We're in the top 10 in terms of currency values. The people we're funding have currencies significantly lower than ours. Take Nepal. It must be, 50 of whatever their currency is to a single dollar. You're multiplying that by 2 million. They recognise the pivotal role of the Australian dollar at the moment. And so long as it's as high as it is, as astronomically high as it will probably continue to be for a while, they can't afford to spend less locally.
So it's become 1 billion times more valuable than everyone else's currency?
Yeah,
not everyone else's. I'm saying people like Nepal are sourcing their goods, whatever they need for the emergency relief, from nearby countries, Bangladesh, India, Taiwan maybe.
Yeah, but what about stuff that's not sexy enough for people to throw their money at? What about helping stopping corruption in Papua New Guinea or East Timor, right?
Clearly haven't done a very good job of that.
We're going into two different kinds of aids here. I'm talking disaster relief, not long-term.
Cool, and plenty of people donate to disaster relief. That's not a problem. But if you want to champion,
you want to throw Papua New Guinea around, though. At the same time, Papua New Guinea was the one that received the least amount of budget cutting. It's also efficiency. Once again, though, it is taking a look at this type of program and removing some things. There are other areas in which we're investing. In actual fact, East Timor and New Guinea will both see 2 new embassies and 2 new foreign affairs stations built in their countries over the next few years.
Yeah, but I don't think increasing a diplomatic presence is akin to, instituting key food insecurity projects to make sure that some of the poorest people in the world can actually eat enough each day to survive. Like, I think that there are key differences there.
Our government is not providing that much for that type of food relief, though.
Yeah, I'm saying we don't provide enough.
I know that, but my issue is that our government is instead spending on other things. Our aim is not to actually try and feed the people. It's once again, if you give a person a fish or a cup of rice for a day, they'll live for a day.
That's not what food insecurity projects are, mate. I'm sorry.
Investment projects,
straight up wrong.
Aid projects are deliberately designed to actually work on stability and developing governments overseas.
But beyond that, right? Aid, you can't just say that aid's about efficiency and we're not getting good value for our dollar, right? Our dollar means shit all when it comes to aid, right? we have a responsibility as a state that is developed in a largely underdeveloped region of the world to fund these countries so they can, like, you can champion these infrastructure projects and, we're going to help these people, get their own fish and stuff. But that's simply not going to happen when you don't give them any money to be able to fund that program, right? Like, I get the point, but it's not, it's the role of the government to be able to, pay for these programs, and the value of your dollar shouldn't matter. It's altruistic. You're not supposed to be expecting a return for this. Hamish, quickly, and then we'll go to wrap up.
Here's the problem with structurally funding these smaller countries, these poverty-stricken countries, and helping them develop their economies. Is the problem is a lot of them compete with us in many key economical sectors. So yes, as being a developed country has its own unique challenges. And the unique challenge is if we help out these countries too much, they're going to outcompete us, and they will cast severe doubt on our long-term future. I mean, look at
all right.
Let's
we don't have enough
I don't
time
think
to
any of us
go
agree
anywhere
there.
near that point. All right, Blake, talk to us about small business again, because this is a part of the discussion that needs to be had.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, as a lot of people know now, small business is the largest employer in the economy. They're the largest generators of wealth, actually, in Australia. If we actually look on a per capita basis, they are. If we don't look at things like agriculture and we don't look at things like mining, small business then comes in as the third largest as a collective group of earners. So the consequence is, of course, that the government recognises that there's a need to try and stimulate this group of people, because after all, we can talk about mining, but ultimately that relies on commodity prices, and we can talk about farming, but the reality is though is that sheep are a pretty stable trade. What we've instead done though is we've tried to boost because we've tried to boost these groups of people. It's a different approach to trying to actually stimulate an economy, because instead of actually just providing a $300 $300 cash hand back to people, what we're actually doing is we're trying to get businesses to try and invest again. Once again, it's a 2% tax cut down from 30% tax on business down to about 28%. You're also going to get deductions for anything under $20,000 that you purchase in the name of your business. So once again, though, as I was saying before, if you do want to buy a cash register for your business, or you do want to buy a laptop, if you do want to buy software or anything like that, you can actually purchase that and get a bit of a deduction on that. And at the same time, that this isn't coming as a cost to the taxpayer. This is the revenue being set aside effectively for this. We're sacrificing revenue earning in order to boost this. And this is our way of effectively getting the economy back on track.
Well, speaking as an unemployed student, I would have to say the best way of ensuring that people are employed is to have more jobs available. And I think that small businesses are definitely the way to go for creating more jobs, especially since small businesses being domestic. If they go into large businesses, it's only going to benefit the Australian economy. And there's a lot of small-scale manufacturing that, due to emerging technologies, will definitely become viable within the next decade. Like we're seeing a massive rise in 3D printed stuff and so forth. So I think that cuts to the small business tax rate can only really be a good thing for the economy. I mean, yes, we do need a way to help out the poor. We can't just use small business as a way to help out the poor, simply because in our economy, which is a post-modern economy and based around the services sector, there is no way there will be enough jobs for everyone. So,
definitely. And I think you want to look at it, though, too. The government's trying to subsidise that again. You've got a $1.2 billion employment program to subsidise wages for older and younger employees. So if you're under the age of 25 and you work for a company for for a business for more than 6 months, that business can apply for a subsidy to subsidise your wages and keep you going a bit longer. Same if you're an older employee. And also at the same time, though, 150,000 retirees in Australia on the lowest levels of pensions are going to get an extra $30 a week to try and subsidise them and try and make sure that they actually have a better quality of life.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I mean, it is the small business sector and the middle class that drives drives the economy in many of the world's leading economies. Like Germany is renowned for its Mittelstand. I think I pronounced it correctly. It's like Germany's entrepreneurial middle class who produce very high quality niche products, and they've allowed Germany to maintain its position as an export manufacturing economy, even despite intense competition. Not composition, that's silly. Competition from places like Asia. And it's the same thing with the British entrepreneurial middle class, who have been credited with leading the British economic recovery. So important that we look at our small businesses.
Look,
Avanti,
anything
thoughts?
that brings our economies in line with Germany and Great Britain is a pretty good idea. And small businesses are more likely to pay tax than multinationals at the present situation.
Exactly.
So I can't really disagree with it.
Yeah.
What about
I
you
think
two?
I think that, the small business, tax cuts are really, they're really helpful. A lot of people need those. But there's also some problems with it. Firstly, foreign workers are no longer eligible to have the $18,000 tax-free threshold. They have to pay tax straight up, which disincentivizes people to come to Australia, and it also harms people who have come to Australia to work, who are unable to to fund this entire new life that they've created for themselves. I think that just to champion the neg here, because everyone seems to be pretty for this. I think that's exactly the problem with it. I think that it's a catch-all. I think it's completely counterintuitive to what the Liberal Party has tried to champion in the previous budget. Yes, this was a Labor policy beforehand, and the Liberals voted it down. This looks like it's the Liberal Party saving face and trying to catch all, like in the purest sense, trying to catch all the voters before the next election. Do you want to respond to that, Blake?
Oh, yeah, look, I think that as much as you could... Like, some people have called it a Labor policy. I think that one, we could have a debate until the cows come home over that one. We can grab the timelines out and we can grab the age out and all the way, 12 years ago and so on and so forth. I think the reality is, though, is that both parties could produce that type of thing right now. I think Labor's come so far to the centre, and the Liberal Party has, to a degree, though, too, to try and produce that type of thing. I think it's also a recognition, though, that it's actually a good policy. I think, though, that the fact that both of the major parties are actually proposing that means that for the centralist parties of Australia, as far as they're concerned, they see this as actually the best way to try and promote the economy in a way that the people are going to that the people can also see and understand.
I mean, I would say that Labor has moved steadily rightward over the past few years, and I would view this policy as being a right-wing kind of policy. I'd say a Labor policy would focus more on workers and working conditions if you were to follow the technical definition of Labor Party. So I would say this would be more of a Liberal policy than a Labor policy, but we've recently seen this definitely could have come from both of the parties, and I think it's good that we actually finally did it, and it's only really going to bring benefits. But the foreign workers one is a bit tricky because, I mean, yes, surely they ought to pay tax if they're going to come to Australia and work, but at the same time, what Tim said about it disincentivizing people from coming to Australia is absolutely true, and we need that foreign money. We need people to come from overseas to help reduce our current account deficit or whatever. I don't know enough about those terms to really.
But do we need people coming from overseas to Australia? I mean, Tony Abbott told us that Jesus didn't want people coming to Australia.
Oh, look, that was a very kind of off the cuff Tony time moment.
Tony, please.
Yeah, but I think at the same time, though, that if you want to take that argument, it's once again that's coming back to a broader issue, which is the immigration debate that Australia just doesn't want to have.
Yep.
In a weird sense, and I think that that's definitely we could basically have an entire session just talking about whether or not immigration should be something that we actually have a proper discussion about in our country. But once again, though, 457 visas are and workers that are coming with skilled backgrounds are important to our economy. But I also think, though, that we need to actually continue to invest in education services for young Australians. And I think, in a way, this is kind of comes back to this question about the efficiency of our education system, whether or not Australia is in actual fact educating people to actually enter into the workforce correctly, or whether we're doing it wrong. And I think that the government's recent plan, $350 million for youth training and employment programs, which has just been introduced, plus a $10 million additional special training program for entrenched unemployment situations, is deliberately trying to get that back in there. And they're not targeting kids to try and get them back into universities. They're not trying to get them into there. They're trying to get them into education for qualifications for, apprenticeships and so on and so forth there. And I think that's actually what we need to be looking at and what we need to be working on, really, because we've got lots of people going to university in Australia. What we also need, though, is in actual fact to have a skilled worker base in our own country.
Speaking of education and universities, do you think that'd be a good segue?
Oh, we can talk about fee deregulation, but I think the debate's pretty standard. You know what I'm going to say. Do you want to have that debate? Do you want to talk about fee deregulation?
Look, we can talk about it, but I think that, to be honest, Glenn Davis can have that discussion for me. I think that both sides actually have their arguments pretty clear. I will just say, though, that I think I don't think it's really appropriate to talk about the American kind of evil corporatization. Yeah. I think that that's a spectre. I think that people want to wave that kind of ghost and threaten people and say you're all going to have to pay $100,000 for your university fees. I think that's a deliberate way to try and scare students and try and scare voters into that situation. And I don't think that that's actually going to be the consequence of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Like my thoughts on fee deregulation are very anti. I don't particularly give a shit whether or not people want to say, oh, education needs to be valuable, right? Education's valuable when more people have it. I think that people, like Australia, needs to be a more educated population. I think we need free tertiary education, to be honest. I'm not going to spend too long talking about this.
Yeah. Look, no, I think if you want to go along that free tertiary education policy, I mean, you could say that there are some merits, but I think the other problem is that we're also dealing with an issue of quality. We've got a lot of high-quality education places centres in Australia, but I think the other thing is that at the moment we're also seeing an issue with overqualification. It's happening not only in Australia, it's happening in the United Kingdom. The United States in particular has a massive overqualification issue. And quite simply, it's because in Australia, in the United Kingdom, and in America, we've got kids going to university, kids going and getting these high qualification and education degrees. And now it requires 2 university degrees to get what 1 university degree used to get. And now students are actually spending longer and acquiring more debt in Australia through HECS in order to just pay for 2 degrees that they shouldn't actually need. We should just be trying to actually go back to the traditional system, go back to the roots, make sure that the people that actually work, like the best students, get those top quality degrees and get out there, and not just be giving people degrees for degrees' sake.
I mean, look, that's fair enough. I do think in a perfect world, tertiary education would be free, and I think that everyone has a right to tertiary education, but at the same time, overqualification is definitely a problem. I know in such sectors as the legal sector, medicine, engineering in the future. Right now, we don't have overqualification for engineers, but you better believe it's going to happen sometime in the next decade. We're just churning them out like a university degree is no longer a guarantor of a job, but I think the issue is that we don't have enough jobs rather than we have too many people, except in some sectors like law, where you're inherently going to have less people working.
Yeah, and on top of that, though, I think we're also seeing that I think the government needs to actually start looking at trying to encourage people to do jobs in areas which are need demand. Yeah, at the moment, you can go into university, you can get your HECS grant on any subject, but the reality is that we only need so many people doing this, so many people doing that. I think it's time that the government actually starts to provide. If university fee deregulation goes through, I personally believe that what we should actually try and see, though, is the government actually not necessarily subsidizing, but trying to promote and stimulate people to go into areas such as like maritime architecture, maritime engineering. I mean, you were talking before, just off mic, about submarines in the future.
Yeah.
Australia has 37 fully qualified, according to Senator David Johnson's estimation. We've got 37 people that can build a submarine. Sweden has 300, Germany's got 500, the United States has got 2,500. The reality is we need more.
That argument rests on the assumption that we need more submarines, right?
No, but that's just an example of a particular sector.
Yeah, what other areas are in such dire need of people that we need to start allocating people to jobs?
Well, maritime engineering is still important because you can build other ships. Right now, Australia hardly builds any ships, but we probably.
But do we need any more ships?
No,
though?
not even more ships.
I think for a land girt by sea, we could always become a seafaring. Like if we actually could become a nation that builds an awful lot of ships as actually part of it. It's work. We also produce, ships unique to our environment. We have warmer waters. We've got shallow waters, and I think if you actually look at it from Australia to the seas of Hormuz, we've got a pretty set climate, and that's one of the issues that has actually happened when we buy off the shelf ships from other countries.
No, look, we don't even build ships. We have to buy them all because we do not have the expertise to produce them domestically at all. Any kind of ship except warships, they're the only ones we build right now. But what I think is that furthermore, the market will also help direct with people to sectors that need more employment. I mean, I'm not a construction industry worker. Tim is, so Tim would definitely be able to tell me more. But I've heard that the construction sector is relatively high paying in comparison to other sectors. That's not because the government said, oh, we need more people in construction. That's because the market said, we want more jobs. We are willing to pay you more so that you build this for us.
But there's always a demand for construction workers, right? And you can't, like they say, you can't outsource a haircut. Like these jobs are not under threat, and therefore there's constantly going to be jobs there. Like you're talking about too many people being too many people being educated in law, and there's like not enough positions in law and stuff. But like, I don't think it's all just about the market. I think, you know, we as a society need to collectively adapt to these new issues rather than just to, you know, say, oh, you know, we've got too many doctors, so we'll let them charge a little more for the degrees and stuff.
No, that's
granted, I'm not one of those greenies that says, oh my god, my degree is going to cost $120,000. Like, I think that's fucking ridiculous. But nonetheless, fee deregulation is not the way to go, especially given that none of the like areas that are in desperate need of education actually have a particularly big deficit of labour, so I don't think that that's a big issue.
I agree. I think the solution to the problem of too many doctors and too many lawyers is not let's increase the cost of their degrees, but let's ensure
provide more medical care.
No, not even that. Let's ensure that other sectors of the market develop the same reputation of providing good, stable jobs as medicine and law.
Yeah. And I definitely think that an area such as construction, I mean, we should be spending more money on trying to get people trained in that area.
Yeah,
too.
not enough people.
Yeah, more qualification for apprenticeships and all that. I mean, once again, there are some, you know, lots of people who are, in actual fact, in construction, plumbers and electricians will earn more money in their first 20 years than a lawyer will in their first 30 years.
Yeah.
Did I just hear the Liberal Party talk about increasing funding for TAFE?
Well, that's exactly what we've done. We've announced $350 million worth of new funding for people to go and get these type of training and certifications under this new budget.
Yeah.
Cool. I want to move on from that because there's another issue here. I want to talk about this budget emergency.
I think we've well and truly gone into education too.
Yeah. Last year, bloody Joe Hockey put the country on like high red alert. Like, guys, we have an emergency. We have like the biggest deficit ever. You know, there's an absolute catastrophe. So we're gonna make cuts to absolutely everyone in order to recuperate these funds. Now the Liberal Party is spending, I think, $82 million more than the highest spending budget of the Labor Party. So, like, granted, I can see that money is going to end up being reaching surplus within 5 years. That rests on the assumption that they're going to get re-elected. But more than that, I think that, you know, this isn't about like surplus and deficit because both of those are very deliberate occurrences. I just I want to talk about how Joe Hockey has like framed this narrative so that, oh, you know, we've got this massive budget emergency, we've got this, you know, huge deficit, and when Australia actually doesn't. What do you think about that, Blake?
Look, I think that we actually do have an issue. That is that we've gone from having the budget entirely in the black under the Howard Costello era. We've seen that, you know, Australia was making a great deal of profit. We had the global financial crisis, but we also had an extremely large amount of increased spending under the Rudd Gillard with Stevia era, and I think that the reality is that under that era, what we should have actually seen was two things. Like how to fix an economy in a crisis, it seems to me that it's quite simple. It's a two-stage procedure. First things first, you do an efficiency drive. You cut out all the areas of spending that we don't necessarily need to do for a period of time.
Like aid?
Well, so I think that takes a step back. I don't think we cut it entirely, but I think it takes a step back for a period of time rather than exponentially grow it under the Rudd government because of his own little ambitions, of course, to become the Lord High God of the United Nations after his time after his time as Prime Minister, and I'm pretty sure he's probably kicking himself right now that he didn't do enough to try and get that job. Look, and then the second part is stimulus. Once again, trying to find ways to actually get the economy confidence in the economy again. I think that the fact that this budget no longer kind of works on that comes back to the fact, though, that we've also seen that we have a plan to fix the deficit. The debt's a little bit more permanent over the next period of time, but debt's something that we can get used to. But the fact is that we now actually we can fix, and that's a gradual period of time. But the one thing, though, that we actually are seeing is that we're trying to tackle the deficit. And the deficit is the most important thing. If we can try and get the deficit back on track and actually say that every year that we are actually making a profit and we're trying to actually get rid of this large area of debt in our economy, we're actually going to work a lot better. And that's what you're seeing. We're going down from $48 million in deficit every year, and then we're going to go down to 42 million this year, and next year it's going to be 35 million, and then eventually in 4 to 5 years' time we're going to get down to 7 million. I think that's actually what we need to be seeing. We need to be seeing people working on reducing the deficit.
Well, I do have several issues with what you've said. I believe that the good economic management of the Howard and Costello years cannot be attributed entirely to good policy by them. In fact, a lot of the money that they made was raised by the selling of public industries, including Telstra and the Commonwealth Bank. That provided a massive portion of liberal funding, and that's not a sustainable business model. You can't just keep selling off national things simply because eventually you'll run out, and then what'll happen? You're screwed. So that's a problem. And secondly, the world in general was enjoying a period of boom during the Howard years, and it coincided with the Howard years. We were seeing unprecedented growth around the world, not just in Australia. And then the financial crisis hit at about the same time as Rudd came into government, and a lot of Rudd's economic policy was in response to the crisis and ensuring that we escaped the crisis unscathed. And yes, we had to go into debt for that, but at the same time, even despite the deficit, we still have one of the lowest debt to GDP levels in the developed world, even despite the enormous level of Rudd spending. So yes, it is important that we reduce the deficit in order to ensure that in the case of future crisis, we are well prepared, but yeah.
I kind of just want to correct you on the world was an exponential growth mode. No, there were about 5 different EU crises, the Southeast Asian crisis. The fact is we took advantage of it. It helped boost our economy for the time being, and it was a really good growth opportunity for Australia, not so much globally.
But I'm still saying the growth of Australia can largely be attributed to global factors during that time period.
No, I don't necessarily think that that's right, because you actually want to look at it in that period of time. You also saw the United States unemployment slowly increase. You saw that the European Union was going along this way. I think you want to really actually look at it. Most of the crisis was happening then. The difference was that we just didn't have the label on it. And you also want to look at it too. Our region was not doing well at all. The fact that Australia mysteriously was doing successful, it doesn't really matter. Like, it's actually important and worthwhile considering that, you know, other countries in our region, even though that we're also looking at the first period of time under the Howard government, that countries like East Timor, Papua New Guinea, okay, we're not looking at them economically similar, but we're also looking at a period of time where these countries are seeing the stability for the first time in several decades, and at the same time they weren't kicking off too. There was an actual period where the economies of the world were not necessarily stalling or failing, but they weren't chugging along at full pace. And I think that we can talk about whether or not the Howard era was worth it, Howard era was wrong, but I definitely think, though, that now it's time to actually look at what we're going through right now, because I think we can all agree that era is gone.
But a deficit's not a bad thing, right? A deficit is not something that happens because of the negligence of a government. A deficit is a very calculated and deliberate measure by the governments enforcing budgets, right? As Hamish said, that this budget that was supposedly created this massive debt crisis in Australia came out of the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. The point of this deficit, right, is that if it was such a bad thing that you're saying, the government wouldn't have increased spending to one of the highest rates of spending in Australian budgets ever in the last in the budget for this year. Ultimately, I think that Australia has above us in terms of net position. There's 3 countries with a positive revenue. All 3 of them are Scandinavian countries. Australia's actually only got the second lowest amount of deficit, and that even extends to deficit per capita isn't anywhere near as much as you could call it a debt emergency. So I think that this whole debt emergency that's being conjured is just a political tool by the Liberal government to try and push out its opposition. I don't think that's a valid argument.
I think that you can say, or you can pull out the Scandinavian countries, but if you also want to look at it, I don't think that you can compare us to other countries, quite simply because there is one thing that we have in common with Scandinavian countries, is that we actually have our mineral industries. They had their oil exports, we've got our mineral industries, and they're the primary drivers of both of our economies.
But I've got a point on that. Go on.
Yeah, look, we've got to we've really got to look at this more from the perspective that, as a general concept, we can't just say, oh, well, the government knew what it was doing at the time, it deliberately manufactured this incident and all that. Well, from my perspective, no, we can't ever, it's not ever correct to really go into a period of deficit, quite simply because deficit actually shows mismanagement. It says that we're spending more than we actually take in a period of...
Which is what's happening right now.
Well, I definitely, yeah, but I think at the same time, though, what do you want us to do? Completely, I mean, you lectured me before, you lectured the Liberals before about the fact that we're cutting spending here, cutting spending there. I mean, what the idea is, though, is that you've got to be able to reduce it over a gradual period of time and ease our way back in. You can't just radically cut it, because in that case, I'll ask you, what do you want to cut? Do you want to cut hospitals? Do you want to cut education? Which one do you want?
Now, before we get to this point, I'd like to talk about my own point about economic mismanagement during the Howard years. Compare what Norway did with its oil to what Australia's done with its mining. In Norway, we saw during the period of boom that they were accumulating an oil fund. They were accumulating lots of money from their oil, and that's being used to fund an enormous amount of government activities. Norway lives off its oil. They've got so much money from it, and as a result, the government can afford to fund this socialist paradise. Whereas in Australia, what we saw during the Howard years were enormous amounts of tax cuts during the mining boom. And these tax cuts ensured that guest business could get big and invest more money. But in the end, they ended up that the whole crisis was caused by businesses investing money in banks that put money into toxic assets. So during the financial crisis, a lot of this money just disappeared. So really, what Australia did the wrong thing during the Howard years. What we should have been doing was building up taxes on mining during the mining boom to ensure the country would be able to weather any crisis that was going to happen. Indeed, should have happened. There were clear signs that the financial crisis was going to happen years before it did, looking at the property market.
I actually want to go back to that. It's that the Scandinavian countries still have special partnerships with EU states and with EU corporations. They actually have abilities to make them pay up their money. They can force them. We've seen it happen countless times with various corporations within the EU. They've been taken to the ECJ. Australia doesn't have that. It's quite simple. We don't have strategic partnerships with the rest of Asia. Any corporation willing to invest in us is kind of the higher power in this situation. We have no real method of making them pay us back.
I would say
to enforce it.
I would say that's a regulatory issue rather than anything else. And
the fact is,
we
leads to serious budgetary problems.
We failed to regulate. We failed to regulate under the Howard years.
But we couldn't have enforced it even under these years.
you want to look at it though. The issue was that I think Australia, as a general concept at that period of time, I don't even think it's necessarily even the Howard years. I think it also goes back to Hawke and Keating. I mean, Keating famously said that we were on our way to becoming a banana republic, and the reality was that we were actually tanking under that. There was that chance that we would slip. There was that chance that we would tank under Keating. And I think that in general, though, the country made an economic decision. Keating made his big swing to the right, came back with a classic Keynesian response, as you always like to brag. And I think that Howard, in a sense, tried to continue a few of these practices on. They tried to keep that consistency, because the consistency and stability of both the Keating and Howard governments was ultimately what actually led to a strong economic growth period at that time. Compared, we weren't in the same situation as Scandinavia and Norway when we entered it. And I think that every country goes into everything differently. Scandinavia and Norway, Scandinavia, a country apparently, Scandinavia.
It's a region. You can call it Scandinavia.
Yeah, Scandinavia, once again, though, was close to Europe. Now, definitely, you look at countries like Finland going from their period of time now to the economic prosperity that they've had. But once again, we're not in the same situation as them. We also have a different economic profile, different demographic profile to Scandinavia, and I think that's definitely something. I mean, our name, we're all not Borkson and all that. We can't just rely on IKEA and Volvos down here in Australia. We actually are in an incredibly different situation.
We don't rely on IKEA and Volvo. We rely on Rio Tinto and BHP. And during the Howard years and during even the Rudd years, there was this massive economic boom. We still, like the Scandinavians, had the European market for their oil. We had the Asian market for our minerals, for our iron ore, for our coal.
It was a developing market at the time, though. I mean, the real mineral boom didn't actually happen really until the start of the Rudd years, and I think, and that's something that I think people need to take into consideration, is that China, in particular, China's like roaring period only really started in 2005, really. And I think that's the thing, is that to say that this whole thing Howard should have done more, Howard should have done this, Howard should have done that. Once again, though, Norway's got the advantage of selling oil. And that's the thing, is that oil's a lot more stable a commodity than things like mining and commodities. Because once again, though, if we make our commodities a little bit too pricey or something like that, well, it's not like Britain. Britain can't go and buy its oil from Saudi Arabia in certain situations. Britain has to buy a certain amount of oil from Norway, a certain amount of gas from Russia, a certain amount of oil from Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, though, I can easily go to Chile and bring minerals to Australia. I can easily go to China. I can easily go to Africa and mine the minerals. I can easily go to Pakistan and mine the minerals there. There are other ways to find minerals in our region, and at the same time, though, it's relatively that you can figure out the economics pretty quickly to make it actually pretty easy to do.
And I guess fracking only really started happening recently, but fracking was a massive shock for the oil industry. I was going to bring that up as a challenge, and then I realized it's not really.
Please don't bring up fracking. You don't want to have this conversation with me.
I mean, look, fracking has many issues, but from a purely economic perspective, it cast a massive shock over the oil industry.
Yeah.
Because it caused the price to drop drastically and destroyed OPEC's stranglehold over oil production.
Yeah, and if you want to look at it, actually, Norway, if you want to look at Norwegian politics, because it's very interesting, I have been paying attention to it. Guess what they're now talking about?
Yeah.
They're talking about a deficit crisis.
Yeah.
So mysteriously, all of a sudden, you actually see that in our top nations, yes, we're doing very well. But the reality is that just because you're in the top and you're succeeding doesn't mean that you can just compare yourself to these other countries around the world. The reality is that we do have an obligation to try and fix debt and deficit.
By creating more deficit.
Well, no,
Well,
it's the
I
second
think that-
tier of crisis spending. You have to start reinvesting within your own economy. in
Sure,
order
and
to
that's what
recover.
the
But you're going
Rudd
deeper into
Gillard
That
bloody.
is not what the Rudd
No,
Gillard
no,
government did.
no,
That was
no.
the very
Bloody
first
governments
phase
were
of the
doing.
crisis.
They
You
were-
don't just spend in
Their
the first
deficit.
phase.
Let me finish.
Settle
Their
down.
deficit was going to decrease over time, and when you cut a government off after one term, after they've introduced that budget, right, and they're still on their way to reaching that God Almighty surplus, right? All you've done is gone, yep, you're halfway through it. Look at all this debt we've got. Like when Tony Abbott gets kicked out of the government in the next election, what's going to happen is that halfway through this Liberal government's, path to prosperity, right? It's only halfway towards this bloody surplus that they want, which is like in 5 or 6 years. The Labor government, hopefully not led by fucking Bill Shorten, is going to inherit all of this debt that is currently led by the Liberal Party, and they're going to be able to point the finger saying, oh, no, there's debt emergency at the Liberal Party. Like, there is no debt emergency. It's deliberate. We can pay that off over time. This is just complete fucking political capital that these two major parties are throwing around stupid terms, talking about what's good for the economy, what's bad for the economy, without actually saying, what good this is doing for Australia, right? There's no debt emergency.
Well, I think from my perspective, it's acceptable to go into deficit during a time of crisis. Simply,
I think that you can say that arguably there is a good reason to go into deficit during a crisis. I mean, naturally, you can't just, we'll just stop education for a few years just to try and fix a deficit. No, it doesn't work like that, of course. The only thing is, though, is that economic crisis is starting to ease around the world. And to be honest, how do you fix that? Well, you fix that by now is the time to actually try and fix that deficit.
Yeah.
Now is the actual time to fix the debt. Quite simply because if you don't slowly try and fix it, and I think that's what we're trying to do, we're trying to ease our way out of it. Then it just stays there, and that's actually how a lot of these countries, particularly Japan, actually got into its little bit of a catch-all crisis there for a period of time. Quite simply because Japan was spending, and they just went, yeah, she'll be right. And then all of a sudden they started going, well, all of a sudden no one was lending money anymore. There was a period of time where the economies of the world, everyone was starting knocking on each other's doors going, it's time to pay us and all that. And it didn't work.
We do have a period of peace and quiet now, and I think that now should definitely be the time where we get out of the deficit while we still can before the aging population takes its toll, because that's going to be a massive, massive problem. We are going to need some serious structural adjustments, whether it's reducing pensions or increasing taxes. One of those is going to have to happen sometime in the future to protect us from the effects of an aging population, because they will be dire, and we need to be ready.
What do you think about that, Blake? Because I'm about to get into this. Just what do you think about this whole aging population, reducing pensions?
Oh no,
or increasing taxes?
No, I don't necessarily think. I think we've got to expand the tax base in order to pay for it. Definitely. Whether some people have talked about, we should perhaps expand on the GST or figure out other ways. I think we've got a changing tax base in Australia, and that's also having an effect because of the fact that we're we're living a lot older. And I think that it's going to change, though, because what we now need to do is we also need to build the economy to actually take on these older people.
Yeah.
People now need to actually work longer than they ever have before.
Yeah, I agree.
And at the same time, once again, though, this also comes back to an issue of education. We're now also spending more time in university, less time in those young years where you're actually making the majority of your money. Once again, money, you earn, it works like a mountain. Once again, you start low, you work up, and then once you get to that point in your 50s, you start slowly earning down again on average because, once again, you're getting access to lower paid jobs. People start kicking you out of places like partnerships and different organizations. The aging crisis is a problem, and if you want to look at it, another great country that is going through this exact same problem is Germany. Germany is facing a massive aging crisis right now, and the response of their government, I'm not necessarily sure how they're addressing it, but they've definitely recognised that there's a time for change, and the Merkel government is definitely working on it over there.
What we need to do is we need to do several things. We need to take on more migrants to ensure that, because migrants will generally be younger, they will help to provide a revenue base, provided that we can get enough small businesses to give them jobs, because obviously if we take on too many migrants without the jobs for them, that'll just create an even bigger problem. But expanding the tax base, that brings me on to another Liberal policy I liked, which was the creation of a tax for online purchases like Netflix or Steam. I think it's important that we tax that stuff, and I would also support the extension of the GST to goods purchased overseas with a value of up to $1,000.
I think
my
that
Ted Baker coats so much.
Yeah.
What do you think, Tim?
Yeah.
I think that GST is probably the worst idea this country has had in terms of taxation. Increase the tax proportionally on the people who need to pay that revenue, right? By putting a 10% tax on like every item available, right? Look at the people who spend more of their more of their income on goods and services, right? It's the lower class, it's the working class, and to a degree the lower middle class, right? It's all the people who don't have the liquid capital to like spend on this shit are being taxed more and more because this GST is saying, yep, everyone has to pay the same amount of tax for the same amount of products. Like this is especially true with like female sanitation products at the moment are being like ridiculously overtaxed because they're not a necessity when they actually.
Can we not talk about that?
No,
I think the solution is females.
That was not fun.
Females can often use male products that are not only cheaper but more effective in many ways. But
let's please
have this debate.
Please,
Do it now.
please keep going.
So
this is the most ridiculous argument you've made so far.
No, I'm not going to keep going with that argument, and it may not be true in Australia, but I have heard it's true overseas. I've only heard it's true, and I cannot provide any personal experience to back up this unsubstantiated claim.
I've heard a rumour,
Sure,
Mr.
so
Speaker.
Let's kill that then.
Yeah, so let's kill it now while we still can.
So yeah, GST disproportionately affects the poor, and while I think that really what you should be doing is just increasing the gross amount of taxes proportionally on the people who are able to pay those taxes the best.
All the
What
same.
do you think?
I mean, GST, but that concept just rolling out GST always punishes the poor, but that's not necessarily true because, quite simply, you're arguing, though, that everyone buys the exact same amount of products and the exact same type of product.
No, I'm saying that the poor spend more of their money on more stuff than the rich people do.
Well, I don't necessarily... proportionally, yes, but I also think, though, that rich people actually buy more products that actually generate a higher GST income. So, for example, though, if we want to look at it... a person that is in a lower economic background would buy, a car maybe worth $10,000 or $20,000. The higher income earners in Australia, are buying Mercedes-Benz. They're buying larger Holden Commodores. They're paying more, and 10% of $70,000 is a lot more than 10% of $20,000. Quite just based on that revenue and that money. I think that ultimately, though, is it something that does it kind of punish a small group down the bottom? Yes, it also punishes a small group up the top a little bit more too. It's an interesting thing, but I think the fact though that nearly every G20 nation on Earth now has a sales tax, has a GST, probably means that you've lost this debate, mate.
It's a staple of the developed world, and I mean, I still think that it does unfairly punish the poor, but at the same time, you're right about the rich still ending up contributing a larger portion simply. But I do think Tim is right here, and the ideal way to go about it would be to find a way to link the income to the percentage of GST you pay on goods, but that's just not going to happen. So it's not going to happen.
So what, you just want to like say, okay, you're going to get to the cash register and go, this is my income proportionally generated, like an amount of
This
GST.
is my ID card telling you how much I earn.
Technology,
Yeah.
technology could eventually enable this, in my opinion.
I know
that's
that,
a
but
topic for another day.
I think that would be that's a day which I don't want to see in my life, quite simply because, I mean, that is, it's punishing the rich. And I think that, I know that, yeah, my Greens Party friend here may potentially disagree, like that concept. But the reality is, though, is that if you're going to pay taxation like that, you might as well just figure out a way to work on the income tax system, which mysteriously is broken. The reason why we actually are relying so much on the GST is because people are now earning money and making money differently than they used to. And that's why the tax base is actually declining in Australia. GST is a great way of making revenue because basically it doesn't actually take into consideration, it doesn't look at how people earn money. It's all about spending money. And so it's actually a more accurate reflection of taxation in Australia and the tax base.
And
And
if everything's cheaper, people will spend more money, and that generates more capital for the economy.
Well, yeah. If people are buying more goods, more tax, and therefore more income.
And when everything's 10% cheaper, people will spend more money.
But the only problem is, though, is that they're not making the tax on that. I mean, the system is as it is right now because we've clearly seen in the past that it's not working.
I'm willing to concede that most of the money generated from GST comes from rich people buying like ridiculous products and stuff, and that's fair enough. But I think that the fact that it disadvantages the poor and it disadvantages women, I think it's not very proportionally fair.
I think that claim about the women's thing, I don't necessarily think that that's I don't think it's appropriate that we should be that we shouldn't be charging GST on things like condoms and tampons. Get away from it. I think that that's something.
why?
But I think that that's also. I think that might be something that's an accident. I think that, to be honest with you, people come up with the idea and they went, well, we're going to take the GST off condoms. The reason why is quite simply because it's birth control and it's promoting good sexual health.
Tampons are more of a basic necessity than condoms.
And I definitely agree with that. But I think that when they were looking at it, they kind of went, okay, it's a sexual health product. We're not going to tax it for that. But a tampon is considered a hygiene product. I don't know why they did it, but I think that's their justification. And I think they need to actually improve on it. I think that they need to actually try and remove the GST on that type of on products like that.
Absolutely fair enough. Absolutely, that was an oversight. There should be a review conducted into that kind of thing, honestly, because it's just not acceptable.
With such things that are being taxed, you really do need to have a review looking at it every couple of years, seeing things that maybe shouldn't be, things that maybe should actually be that aren't be. And female hygiene products, sexual health products, you do not want them taxed because that is another thing that's going to be a drain on the economy in the long run.
Yeah, it's just important that people be able to afford these. But
and it's also it's an additional essential part of the public health service.
I think that as spending moves more and more offshore and we import more from web retailers, there does need to be the GST placed on online goods as well, simply because everyone's going to escape it otherwise. And we're already seeing that.
GST leakage, that's actually one of the reasons why we need to expand the tax base once again, because online retail is changing the tax base in Australia. It's changing employment, and it's changing the way that we spend and earn money.
Another thing is because we don't have to pay GST to online retailers, they are gaining a competitive advantage over Australian retailers simply because they're not from Australia.
So you're a protectionist?
No, currently we are the opposite of protectionist.
No, I'm asking if you are a protectionist.
No, but I do think that we should compete on an equal playing field to online businesses.
So you think
that
because
damn Spotify
everything is so expensive in Australia, that's why people spend from overseas. If you put taxes on that, it makes life generally more unaffordable for most people.
Such is life, but I'd rather have more businesses in Australia that are able to provide employment.
My position comes quite simply from fairness. It is, once again, though, if a retail business in Australia is charged, if retail businesses in Australia are charging GST for a product, then quite simply it should also be the case, though, that the online retail service is also charging the exact same amount. It's not a protectionist policy, in my opinion. It's quite simply the fact that in our country, we think that if you're buying a product or you're buying a service or anything like that, you pay 10% income. You pay 10% of that product goes to tax.
And I mean, I don't think protectionism is a good idea because it only drives up prices.
Yeah,
but I
exactly.
would
But
rather...
like that's exactly what you're all arguing.
No, that is not protectionism. Protectionism would be if we decrease the price on our retailers while increasing the price on online retailers.
Yeah.
What we are doing is providing a level playing field rather than protectionism. And quite frankly, I would rather the jobs in retail be Australian than overseas, simply because I'm an Australian and I want there to be less unemployed people, more tax revenues.
It's flat planing it. It's actually
Yeah.
creating an economy where everything is actually treated the exact same way. The mode of sale is no longer actually going to alter the way that we assess that product.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing is, you're talking to a couple of unemployed university students whose
Yeah.
main potential for employment is the retail sector. We
Yeah.
kind of want jobs staying in the country.
I've applied for a bunch
Yeah.
of jobs and can't
And
get
no
them
one is
because there
going
just
to
aren't
hire
enough
us.
jobs.
But I think that also at the same time we've also got to accept the fact that retail is unfortunately something that is dying slowly.
Yes.
Quite simply because even if you do throw a sales tax on a product, like if you do throw a sales tax on a product in Australia, it doesn't really matter because people are buying online for other reasons these days also. But again, it is all about that it is about that equity. We need to make sure that people are actually paying the appropriate tax for the products that they buy.
Yeah. What do you think, Tim?
I think we should end it there.
Fair enough.
I'm sure-
No less sexy than ISIS?
It's been a good discussion.
Not
Not
this
this
week.
week.
Shame.
There was something about ISIS people using people smuggler boats to infiltrate Europe.
Well,
What?
they've got this whole new foreign affairs policy there where they're going to try bombing. Apparently, they're going to start bombing boats on the coast before they can actually be used to actually smuggle people overseas.
Interesting.
I think
The
that's
government's trying to do that with the budget, aren't they? They've allocated like $300 million to fight
400
piracy.
million.
Yeah.
Piracy.
Yeah, no,
Piracy's-
they want to enter Middle Eastern waters to stop piracy and ultimately to stop terrorism.
Well, I mean-
piracy is part of a broader international commitment.
Yeah.
There is a massive international thing that's going on there, but also because that actually affects Australian shipping lanes.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's vital to making sure that Australia's economy is broader long term. It's a small thing,
There was that
but
one-
naturally, once again, confidence is only as strong as the waters that we travel in.
The
Feels
other
that
thing is,
way.
over the next 70 years, it's possible we end up being the US Navy service, say, or they're patrolling. Dear God, I can't English this morning. We're going to need to achieve blue water capabilities. There's a reason we're buying subs and ships and trying to develop the technology on our own, and it only makes sense if we begin to project our power now.
Blue water capabilities in Australia would require a massive finance commitment that I don't think we should go through
Yeah.
with. All we need
But
are
it isn't something
submarines.
we need to fund just ourselves because the US budget is going to pledge an impressive amount of money towards us as well.
Submarines, 1 or 2 fleet oilers, a few destroyers. That's all we really need. We need enough to protect ourselves.
Well, yeah, Australia doesn't. I mean, let's actually face it. The bogeyman of China is not necessarily a threat. It's not a threat that we need. When the Japanese were talking about Australia being invaded in the Second World War, they knew that they needed 300,000 men to hold Australia down.
They were never going to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing, though, is that if we actually want to really look at it, the thing that Australia needs to do is police our waters. And that's actually what our defence forces is really designed to do, is to actually our Navy is designed to really patrol and protect and secure our own close waters. And I think at the same time, you want to talk about a blue water fleet, it's not necessarily the wisest idea in Australia, considering that you actually want to look at it. The United States ships, United States Navy, when they send ships to Australia, they've got to go and get maintenance a lot more because their ships are designed for the cold waters of the Atlantic, cold waters of the North Pacific, not warm waters down in Australia too.
And we can just contribute our Navy assets to US task forces like we currently do.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think if we wanted true blue water capability, the best way to go about it would be nuclear submarines, which is not an option Australia is going to consider for numerous...
Not for the next 10 years, maybe, but again,
for
we're talking
emotional
foreign policy
reasons.
at the moment. That's at least another
Yeah, I
century's
think that-
argument.
Yeah, I think that atomic energy in Australia, like the future on that, is something that actually needs to be, that's a discussion that Australia will need to have, and I think
Yep.
it's what the report that's going to be generated in South Australia is a fantastic start on the fact that we're actually going to need to start having that discussion.
Well, I'm pro-nuclear, but you can
Yeah.
listen to a previous episode of Political Party for my thoughts on that.
Very good salesmanship. Excellent.
So we'll quickly go around the room and have everyone's, because that
Too
was
controversial.
that was our whole debate time. We're going to quickly go around the room and everyone can give like their final thoughts on the budget and stuff. We'll go to a song and then we'll come back to parody news.
China and then they
killed
our manufacturing.
Blake,
look,
final thoughts on the budget.
Look, the reality is we spend most of our time talking on aid, but the reality is that in actual fact, the government's aim here was quite simply to try and get consistency. It's trying to get fairness, and I think it's trying to spread money as much over the area, considering that we don't have as much. And I think if you want to actually look at it, our job was quite simple. We wanted to try and stimulate. We wanted to try and get people working. We wanted to try and assist low-income earners. And of course, we did it through our ideological method. I mean, after all, that's how we do it. We've done it the way that we've done it in the past. We stimulate small business. But it's also great to see, though, that we've actually tried to actually show that we care about other areas. I mean, the fact that here no one wanted to talk about farming, no one wanted to talk about regional infrastructure.
I think we didn't get to
or
it.
Northern Australia. Well, I know, because you were too busy talking on such an insignificant portion of the budget that you didn't want to focus on the fact that we actually have key economic things. You want to continually bash us over the head about the small area of emotional things, when in actual fact we should actually be talking about the bigger picture here, which is the Australian economy, the Australian people, and how you are not interested in doing that, because the reality is that you actually accept the Labor government could not have done any better in their spending than we did, because once again, as I've actually said, it's all about spending funds, trying to spread the money as best we can.
Avanti, final thoughts on the budget?
Look, I'm with Blake on all of this completely, of course. I'm with the Libs on the way they're trying to institute economic principles. The fact is, we have to look at it as an Australian economy in the global sector, and it's changing. It is going to screw us over unless we manage to get special relationships with the EU, and we need to think about our economic future as a country, not just for the next year or for the next government, but for the next century. And the Libs are the only ones capable of providing that.
All right, so
Dan,
yeah,
final
all right,
thoughts?
let's leave foreign aid there. I think that calling it an insignificant emotional part of the budget is pretty harsh. I think that realistically, if we were given 10 hours, we could have got to all of it. But I think foreign aid is a hugely important part of this budget because it is affecting the poorest people in the world. And these are savage cuts to people who struggle to survive each day. Right, but we'll ignore that for now, even though it is $1 billion of revenue that could have been completely sourced by closing corporate tax loopholes, which no one's done. It could have been sourced by... Mate, I am getting there. All right, it could have been solved. All of this could have been funded by making multinational corporations pay their fair share instead of saying, oh, we'll look at it, we'll investigate it, but we won't do much. You see, these are key areas where we could have raised revenue, right, for our economy, right? These are key areas where we could be collecting tax from companies that sure as hell can pay it, but we're just letting them get away with not paying it, right? We are creating all these loopholes, right? Because big business ultimately is still a good friend to the Liberal Party, right? And we're still seeing that is the, you know, that's the area that they want to help the most, right? Not the poorest people in Australia, not the salt of our country, the people who work hard every single day to try and stimulate our economy, to try and make a living for their families. Instead, we're seeing cuts to families, we're seeing cuts to education, we're seeing cuts to Medicare, we're seeing cuts to aged care, we're seeing all of these cuts. They're now hidden, right? They're hidden in the budget as opposed to last year where the Liberals said, okay, here they are, everybody. How's that? And everyone and the public reacted. Now we're seeing them hidden inside the budget, and it's still going to affect people. And I just hope that when these bills come to Parliament, right, that the Australian people actually realise when it's pointed out what the Liberal government is trying to do to this country, you know, what's going on. And look, the one really positive thing that came out of this budget, the small business tax cuts, Labor policy originally, right? The Labor Party is still the best party to manage this country's economy and to guide us into the next century, as Avanti said.
Cool. I think that, like, I'll agree with Blake that we did squirrel this debate a bit by just focusing it on foreign aid. Which, as you said, was proportionally a low part of the budget, but that was the problem that we all had. The government set a goal with this budget in terms of creating a stimulus for small business. They're aiming to fight multinational tax avoidance by making tax avoiders pay back double plus interest. I think the government, with the goals that they've set for this budget, have done have been largely successful. I mean, I think most of it's already been passed. The opposition by the Labor government in Parliament was absolutely pitiful. I think in this budget, there's been like some like small steps made towards the progress that I would like to see as a Greens voter, but Indigenous people, mentally ill people, victims of domestic violence, asylum seekers, the environment, and national security have all been disproportionately funded. And so I think that while this budget is a step in the right direction, it's nowhere near where we're supposed to be. Hamish, final thoughts?
Well, yeah, I agree. I think we did disproportionately focus on foreign aid. Maybe I had something to do with that with my controversial statements, but I think, I just think that there were some parts of the budget that were good, like the small business reform, like small business tax cuts, and some parts that were bad, like the cuts to New Start, privatization of privatization of HEX debt. So it's definitely a better budget than the last one, but then anything would be a better budget than the last one, pretty much, unless it was, let's do away with government entirely and move to an anarchical system. So those are my closing thoughts.
Cool. All right. We're going to go to a song about powering an economy with finite resources. This is The Bank of England by Enter Shikari. That was a fun debate in the break there. I hope you enjoyed Enter Shikari, and now we're going to play Parody News.
Parody News, the game where you guess which news articles are real and which ones aren't. Starting with our first article. Anniversary of Jesus' death once again coincides with annual chocolate festival. True or false?
I think that's like a parody article about Easter, maybe.
Do you know, I'm going to say, if that was true, my parish priest would have talked about it for about an hour because he is a chocolate addict.
I mean, hang on. Like, sorry. So it's a parody article, obviously, but that is like, I mean, that's not an untrue statement.
No,
Yeah.
I think it's a fantastic reflection. Just let's start making all our religious holidays specifically develop a particular area of food.
Yeah,
industry.
specifically film a particular area of
Christmas
industry.
is turkey.
Yeah. Christmas is
Christmas
gifts.
is foul. Yeah,
Wait,
it's
now what
chocolate.
can we do with Ramadan?
Oh, let's not go there.
Let's not go there,
Yeah,
Hamish,
let's not go
please.
there. Let's not-
Save that for when Chloe's here next week.
All
Next
I'm saying
article.
is that religious holidays should be made to serve particular segments of industry. All religious holidays of all faiths.
Let's move on, please.
Hold on, as an Irish
Equality.
Catholic, we firmly
Stop.
service alcohol.
Equality
There
for
we go.
all. Now, next article. Election candidate who got no votes demands recount because he picked himself.
Oh no, that's
That's-
so true.
that's-
That's so true. That was so funny.
That's an article from The Onion, given that phrasing.
No, that's not. No, it's not. It's
Okay, what do
true.
you
That's
dudes reckon?
true.
Oh,
It was-
I don't know. I know a couple of people. I definitely know there'd be a few socialist alternative members out there.
And
Just-
funnily enough, that's what he was. He was a socialist in England.
Yeah, exactly. Once
Even
again.
Marco Rubio, though. This is something I fully believe could happen.
Well, it is in fact true.
Hey.
And he was member of the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition. So yes, he was a socialist.
There we go.
Isn't that hilarious? Speaking of hilarious, let's move on to the next article. Nice segue there. Cocaine-eating butterflies propose to replace herbicides in Colombia.
True.
True.
Drugs in Colombia, just true.
Peru is now the world's biggest manufacturer of cocaine, so false.
Yeah, but
And
butterflies.
and the
Butterflies.
the pesticides that they use to stop the coca plants from growing have just like had a massive like funding aid cut sort of deal. So I imagine that would be true.
Oh god, let's not do this.
Well, it is in fact true.
Oh, wow.
Enjoy your cocaine butterflies. Now for our next article. Prince Harry comes to reclaim Australia.
I want that to be true.
Well, I mean,
So much.
we've all seen the pictures of Prince Philip and the Queen as UKIP voters on the streets of London, how to vote UKIP's colours. So there's a chance. There's a chance.
I mean, look, the royal baby's name was George, and George was the same king who was king of America while it was still British. So I'm not saying they're going to take over.
Is that
the
like an
world.
Illuminati type link there? Like,
I'm not saying
Just
that-
wait till we give him the mic on Conspiracy Week in a couple of weeks
We're
coming.
never gonna get it back.
What's
I'm
that
not-
like large whiteboard there with all the triangles?
I see the links. There's
Yeah,
actually
yeah,
these
Now,
like
I'm not
floating
saying
pieces of
that
paper
Britain's
with
going to
names on it.
recolonize everything, but you're not going to stay independent forever.
And it wouldn't be really bad if they did.
Britain's coming for you.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I am
Shots
totally
fired.
pro-colonialism.
Yeah, but the
What?
article.
Sorry, wait, what?
Stop! We're not talking about this. We're not
gonna
talking
get back
about
to
this.
That
We're
could be
moving
on our
on.
future week. No, but
Okay.
the article is in fact false, unfortunately. Next
Shame.
article. The words fair and headwinds, biggest winners from 2015 budget. Now, I know some of you have seen this, so don't spoil it.
This is like
Sorry, what was it?
factually true though.
Sorry, what? Sorry.
The
what
words
was
fair and headwinds are the winners of the 2015 budget.
Headwinds.
Yeah. Because we've got economic headwinds, like the
it?
fall of iron ore value.
Yeah.
Better iron out that issue. Bit ordinary, don't you think? Anyway,
Yes, yeah.
what do you dudes think?
Oh, you go ahead. I already know the answer to this one.
I guess I'm just gonna say that's a parody article.
It is a parody article, but it's definitely got a measure of truth to it. Next article. I can't be racist because I'm an ethnic minority woman, says a university diversity officer.
I
What?
said that yesterday.
I reckon that's on the Onion just by the extremely local focus of that title.
I know, but at the same time, though, it does sound like things that I have read.
At the same time, socialist alternative do exist. So-
Yeah, it's just like university is still university. The last time I checked, so there is quite a possibility it is true.
Heh. Well, it is in fact true.
Oh.
What?
Well,
I'm not
Avanti,
even surprised.
there's your
Not
excuse, Avanti.
even-
You're an ethnic
Ah.
minority woman. You
Whoa.
can't be racist.
And I support the libs, so you can clearly see there is
And
nothing-
colonialism,
Yeah.
which doesn't make any sense to me.
It doesn't make any sense to me either.
We'll
but
get
that's
into this later. You can see.
okay.
Sits
This
here
is
in
our,
style.
our last article, which is really quite amusing. NSA chief, I didn't lie to Congress about spying on millions of Americans. I just forgot about it.
True.
That's
So true.
That's so
That
true.
was basically just
That
a
is
week of
so
news
true. That
CNN.
was their entire trial.
You're right.
Well, why not? The guy's just sitting in. We saw the assistant defense secretary the other day, just going, "Oh, we're not sending bombers to Australia."
It is in fact true. Never
Wow.
assume something is conspiracy when it can be attributed to human stupidity.
Coming from Mr. Conspiracy.
And because it's Americans.
And on that note, I'd like to thank Avanti, Blake, and Daniel for joining Hamish and I on Political Party this week.
Yes, cheers, dudes.
Thank you.
Good discussion.
Political Party, putting the cool in political.